then I will be able to see things more clearly. And although that physically meant that I actually went home, I was carrying out the research in Sofia, which is not my hometown. And I was essentially an outsider as much as I would be anywhere else in the world. But there was an element of this where I was at home while carrying out this research, because of the nature of the activities that were carried out and how naturally they came to me. And this might seem like a strange beginning for a presentation that wants to talk about transitions, but as I progress with the presentation, hopefully you see where I'm coming from. So for those of you who haven't spent a lot of time thinking about the Urban Nexus, I just wanted to highlight certain things. So essentially, there are different interpretations and definitions of what's included in the nexus. But if we're looking for common denominators, then we're looking at interactions, interdependencies between two or more elements. Quite often we talk about systems. That allows us to focus on how things are connected. So that means that we examine not only the synergies, but also the conflicts and the trade-offs between these different elements, how they arise and how they're being managed. So specifically in this project, we adopted an understanding of the nexus, which was around interacting social and physical systems. So that means that we took a quite multi-centric approach. We were interested in nexus thinking and nexus practices. And in different stages of the study and even in different sites, we encountered different variations of the nexus. So sometimes we were talking about energy, water, food nexus, food, energy, water nexus, water, energy, food nexus, and so on, essentially studying the same thing. So if in my presentation I referred to more than one of these, please don't be alarmed. One of the reasons why we felt that we couldn't talk about urban systems and how they are linked to each other and what the synergies, conflicts, and trade-offs that emerge, it's because we needed to really talk about the increasing importance of climate change in the environment. And this is something that a lot of nexus literature and thinking is picking up on. But I also want to warn you that this is a different type of project from the Urban Nexus projects and the urban thinking, which are based around finding more efficient ways in which to bring together different urban systems. That usually happens with the introduction of new digital technologies or new data. Instead, what we were interested in were the non-technical and nature-based solutions. We were interested in the ways in which, particularly those that live in the periphery, people who are marginalized and considered to be vulnerable, how did they actually experience in practice these different elements of the urban nexus? To study this, we've decided to focus on 3 systems of provisioning and study 3 essentially user practices. That was urban gardening, making Zimnina, and domestic heating. So I would say that when I started the project, what I imagined to be urban gardening turned out to be very different from the urban gardening that I encountered. So the urban gardening, when we speak about it as a practice, we're referring to essentially an informal practice which involves all activities related to the growing of food, and they're not limited to the boundaries of the city. We found that a lot of urban gardening was carried out in a way which had strong connections with other spaces, which are beyond the city walls, so to speak, and some of them could be quite far away from the city itself. So we studied a wide variety of urban gardening spaces, so from allotments and community gardens to peri-urban off-ground cultivations. And that kind of urban gardening was happening in loads of different places, from people's windowsills to terraces to sunroofs to little green spaces in between blocks of buildings. But what were interesting for us was the functional relationship that the different activities involved and spaces involved in urban gardenings had to each other. So that means the way in which any elements of the practice of urban gardening depends on a flow of resources and materials from the city. So when I talk about making Zimnina, I bet a lot of you don't even know what I'm referring to. I'm hoping that the Bulgarian listeners today know exactly what I mean. So making Zimnina is referring to a broad category of informal practices, usually carried out by households to preserve food for the winter. This is most usually involves canning fruits and vegetables. And just so to help you, this is the remaining Zimnina that I have for this winter period. It's not a lot, and it's more like gold dust. I don't know whether you can see it, but I'm holding up a jar of tomato sauce to my camera. Can anyone see it?
Yeah, we can see it. Yeah. Thanks.
I see it.
Okay, great. Excellent. So this for me is more important than gold dust. So making Zimnina is something that traditionally happens in Bulgaria. It's been going on for decades, and it's something that I spent my childhood doing. So the food practice was basically domestic heating and how people were coping with increased energy use. So I want to do this. I want to talk to you about encountering the urban nexus in Sofia for this study in pictures. So when I started looking at urban gardening, these are the kind of spaces that I visited. So this is in a parking spot between different multi-story buildings in Sofia. I believe that this is the house that, or living quarters that belong to the person that's guarding the parking lot. And I can tell you that they had an amazing kind of garden growing loads of very tasty tomatoes. This particular place, it's quite close to one of the first and most well-developed urban gardens in Sofia. It's called Druzhba, Gadinka Druzhba, and it's a collaborative project involving different individuals. Some of them live in the blocks that you can see in the distance. Majority of them come from all over Sofia. Some of them would travel more than an hour every day to come and tend to their gardens. Right, when I talk about making Zimnina, I had to say that I expected initially that Zimnina would be made within the specific places where people lived. I expected that will be houses that will be in their yards. It will be happening mostly in kitchens. But what happened, in fact, is that the practice of Zimnina making was something that was extremely spatially disaggregated. It involved a lot of transformation. So here you can see peppers that are being grilled at the entrance of a building, which is only 10 minutes away from the Bulgarian parliament in Sofia. So it's in a very central location. And the lady is preparing Zimnina early in the morning, and she was doing it in the corridor of her building because it was the coolest place in the summer. And obviously there was a lot of heat involved in grilling the peppers. But I also found that people were carrying out different elements of the transformation of the fruits and vegetables that they were preparing for the winter in different places. So quite often I encountered people who would use public spaces. You can see that another way to grow the peppers was to do so in a makeshift oven, which was bang in the middle of a road, not that far from Sofia city center as well. So what I didn't expect is when I talk to people about observing how they make something like the tomato juice that I'm showing you now, it's called Luteniza, that would actually involve me following different activities, which in some cases took place over more than 1 week. So to clarify, to make something like this jar of Luteniza, you'd have to peel a lot of tomatoes. You have to grill and peel and chop a lot of peppers. In some cases, there are additional herbs that go in. The interesting thing is that there is a lot of preparation which is involved, and a lot of people living in an urban environment, densely urban environment like Sofia, do not have access to all the tools and the spaces that they need to carry out these activities. And that's one of the reasons why we found that urban gardening and making Zimnina were things that were happening with strong connections to other places. In a lot of cases, I saw people that would do part of the preparations in the city, on their terraces, rooftops, outside buildings, on the street. And they would freeze and they would transport what they have prepared to another place, which could be an ancestral home. I think the most extreme case scenario was someone drove to Ruse, which is on the other side of the country. And it's a journey that takes several hours in order to complete the final stage of Zimnina making. And then people drove back home with the jars of Zimnina where they stored them. Similarly with urban gardening, I found that a lot of people had gardens in their ancestral homes outside of the city, and they would regularly travel to them. They would regularly carry out different equipment with them, and in some cases, in the intense months of urban gardening, people would actually travel there almost on a daily basis. So it wasn't the neatly bounded practices that I expected. In case you're wondering what happens to the Zimnina once it's made, this is quite a fair representation of what happens to it. What you're looking here is the amount of Zimnina on average that is needed for 2 people to basically rely on heavily during a winter period. So you can see there's a lot of jars. Some of these desserts, they include fruits and compotes, but the majority of them are different types of vegetables and meals which have been pre-prepared. Of course, in an urban environment, it also transpired that it's a luxury to have a space like this in order to store the Zimnina, and quite often I found that these stashes of Zimnina would be literally embedded in other living spaces. I've seen shelves of Zimnina in people's bathrooms, people's toilets, under beds, on top of kitchen cupboards, and in quite a few cases for people living in flats, I see these little storage areas in communal areas where they stack jars and jars of Zimnina. This particular jar of Zimnina has a huge significance for me personally as a researcher and for the project. This is a jar of Zimnina which comes with its own history and has led me to seek new ways with which to engage with policymakers. But what you're seeing here is essentially what a vulnerable pensioner in Sofia would eat in one day during the winter. And the significance of this is it. So when I talk about the Urban Nexus, this is exactly what the Urban Nexus looks like. So it's not a neat little diagram that shows how different systems interact with each other, but this is a jar that tells the story of how urban gardening and making Zimnina and Sofia are used by vulnerable people every year in order to allocate resources that they have at their disposal and to cope with fuel poverty. And in their own words, I call it the fuel poverty nexus, a jar a day. This jar belongs to Anna, who was 86 in 2018 when I spoke to her. And in her own words, she prepares the jars of Zimnina, like this one, in such a way that when she opens it up in the morning, she's able to have at least 3 meals out of it. So she puts everything, so she puts the seasoning, the salt, the vinegar, and this is done so that it would not need to add anything else at a later stage, and that it's done in a way that it will be perfect for her to open in the morning and eat throughout the day and finish for dinner. So the way she does this is usually she puts it on, so she takes out a few peppers that you can see with a bit of seasoning, and she puts it on a piece of bread, and this is what she eats for breakfast. Then for lunch, she would usually use a lot more of the sauce, and she would just dip the bread in. She will have more bread with lunch and with the dinner. And the beauty of this jar is that it has helped her survive. Jars like this have helped her survive and cope with the energy bills for decades. Sometimes she has it cold. Sometimes she puts it on top of the log burner that's in her house, in the one room in which she lives in, usually during the winter. This jar is really useful for her because it's really easy to store. If it's properly done, it can keep for 6 months. And it's an important way in which she actually controls how much energy she uses during the winter months. So I'm going to expand on this a bit later on, but the key message I want to highlight here is that how this jar is actually prepared in order to serve the purpose of keeping good and tasty for 6 months and giving her an opportunity to eat for a day. That has come with special obligations and requirements of how the process of making Zimnina is carried out. So in order to ensure that a jar can keep for this long and it's ready to eat, you have to use open fire in order to boil to high enough temperature. Everything needs to be washed really well. It's not something that it can be done on a hob, but it will require a lot of electricity. So the preference of a lot of people is to start open fires in order to complete that part of the process. And in this particular quote, you can see the direct link between how the jars are prepared and the purpose that they serve is to help manage heating bills. What is not included in this particular quote, but it would be quite useful to know, is that Anna spends more than 5 to 6 months a year in a little shack outside of Sofia, where she has a plot of land where she grows all the vegetables and all the fruits. She does also a lot of gathering in the nearby area, and this is what she uses in order to prepare her jars of Zimnina. Anna is not an exception. Anna is unfortunately one of many people that I found in Sofia who were living in those ways. So Maria is another example. So she was also a pensioner. She lives quite close to Sofia city centre, and quite close to the picture of the lady using a gas grill to grill peppers was taken from. She has been making Zimnina all her life. It's the way she was raised. It's the way that she looked after her family when she was younger. And it's what she resorted to once she became a pensioner. So for her, starting to preserve food for the winter starts as early as June, but as the case with Anna, actually she starts preparing her urban garden in March. So it's a very long process. So she peels, boils, fries, stuffs, and closes jars with fruit and vegetables almost every day. From June until the end of September to make enough food to last her until April next year. And I already showed you a photograph of how much food is required. So Maria talked a lot about her experiences on what was the right way of preparing the Zimnina, putting a specific emphasis on the importance of cleaning all the vegetables, fruits, and glass jars and metal tops really well. So it's very water intensive process. Frying everything long enough and boiling the stuffed jars at a high enough temperature so that it lasts for 6 months. So usually you see that there's different types of energy sources which are used, from gas to wood, and in some cases to coal, and electricity in order to prepare these Zimninas. She makes 1 liter jars of mixed vegetable seasonings, cloves of garlic, which can be eaten cold as well, salad warmed up on the wood burner in the room. So she makes smaller jars of about 200 to 300 millimeters of compote. So these are pieces of sweetened fruit in water, which could be a dessert or breakfast in a day. And as with Anna, her practice is driven by the need to provide a full meal or even multiple meals for the day for herself. This allows us to spend a minimum amount of money on buying things which considers to be necessities during the winter. So that would include, in her own words, medicine, bread, and soap. Everything else that she has in terms of pension, she spends on bills, with heating and electricity being the biggest one. An example is when I spoke to Maria, her pension was 360 leva, and her energy bill was more than half of that on a good month. So for Maria, making Zimnina is an important way to redistribute food for the winter, and it's impossible without growing her own fruits and vegetables to do so. So the reason why I wanted to talk about Maria and Anna's experiences is because they provide a very good illustration of the food and energy interdependencies that we see in the Urban Nexus. And these are kind of interdependencies that were not easily visible unless unless you speak to vulnerable people and unless you watch the different practices that they're involved in repeatedly. Some things are not even clear for themselves, and they transpire through the process of observation and helping them by chopping up things and grilling and so on. So the energy use, or particularly the non-use of energy, dictates decisions about urban gardening and making Zimnina, and that covers the point of seeding to the point of consumption. So choices about what is going to be planted and when, mostly driven by how much Zimnina is needed, what grows well, and what some of these individuals, they live on their own, so what they would be able to actually prepare and store. Also, at what point do they decide to pick the fruits and vegetables so that they're suitable for preservation and consumption? That's a very important aspect of it as well. So, as you've seen from statements from Anna and Maria, the way Zimnina is prepared is closely linked to how energy is used or not used at the point of consumption, and the fact that it's really a jar a day that makes them keep up on top of their electricity bills. So what I've seen is that vulnerable people prepare Zimnina in a way which does not need to be cooked, heated or refrigerated. And these are the ways in which they basically control how much energy they use during the winter period. So what energy and how much energy will be available and used for the making of Zimnina and its consumption can shape practices of urban gardening. So what to grow, when to plant, and how Zimnina is prepared, stored, and consumed. So also the way Zimnina is made is shaped and shapes energy access and use, and it can affect how urban gardening is practiced. The important thing here about this particular element of the Urban Nexus is that it's the practices of urban gardening and making Zimnina, when considered together, when synchronized, when they're kind of complementary, that allows people the means for resource redistribution between the seasons. And those resource redistribution includes energy. And this is an important finding when we're talking about energy transitions. The one thing I wanted to highlight in this presentation is that sometimes you can only see things if you're at the right place at the right time. And for me, the Urban Nexus and the relationship to food, water, energy, and the environment came together in a very powerful way once I started my second bit of fieldwork in Sofia between January and March 2018. And the reason for that is that when I landed in Sofia very early in January that year, I was literally greeted by the winter fog.
I'm delighted
So
to be
this
able
is
to talk
a
to you
beautiful
today.
photograph
Morning
of
coffee.
one of the kind of more prominent bits of the surrounding environment that you can see in Sofia. But also, apart from the beauty, focus on the kind of the fog that you can see that would lay over the city. This fog is particularly difficult to breathe in. And it was in the winter of 2018, it was there for several weeks. It dictated how people, when people will go out, how often people will open their windows. And this happened during a very cold spell in Sofia. If I remember correctly, it was minus 15 degrees Celsius. So the reason why I started with this is because we have to, in order to talk about the urban nexus in Sofia, we have to introduce two things. I mean, fuel poverty, I think it became abundantly clear that it was something that was at the heart of the nexus. But I want to spend some time talking about the connection between fuel poverty and air pollution. So they are tightly linked. Bulgaria has long been the country with the highest rates of fuel poverty in the EU. There are different estimates. The most recent one says that it's something between 42 to 60% of Bulgarian population experience fuel poverty, and that could be particularly seasonal. So people might be experiencing fuel poverty for several months of the year. Unlike situations that we see in other places that we carried out urban nexus studies, such as Brazil and Kampala, in Uganda, we saw that a lot of the people who will be classified as fuel poor were actually working individuals, and they had what you consider to be good jobs. Fuel poverty rates were particularly high in densely urbanized areas, such as Sofia. At the same time, Sofia is one of the several most polluted European cities in southeastern Europe. The particular air pollution that is pertinent to this project and to the urban nexus is particulate matter, and that's mostly due to the use of firewood and coal for residential heating. And it's not just the resource that's being used, but it's a combination of infrastructure and practices. So a lot of the residential heating of burning of wood and coal happens in old and inefficient stoves. And I would like to highlight that the reason why this is happening also is due to other elements of infrastructure that we should consider. So the majority of the vulnerable people I studied during this project lived in what I consider to be badly insulated buildings. So there are very low levels of energy efficiency. In some places, people had taped the windowsills with sellotape, put towels around them in order to keep the rooms that they were heating airtight. Also, this is specifically linked to district heating and how district heating is provided in many areas of Sofia, and the quality of the service which is provided by district heating. So I'm mentioning these things because quite often we think about fuel poverty as something that happens at the point of consumption and something that happens to specific people who are vulnerable because of their personal circumstances. So vulnerability such as long-term unemployed, disability, or being a pensioner. Unfortunately, we discovered that being a pensioner is a specific type of vulnerability in this context. Instead, what we found is that these vulnerabilities emerged as much from personal circumstances as they emerge from the infrastructure transitions that were happening and have been happening for some time in Bulgaria. So, for example, the district heating that was put in place in Sofia in the 60s and 70s meant that the installation of already at that point quite old type of infrastructure, then there were inefficient ways in which use of hot water and heat are being measured and people pay for. It also leads to problems with the way in which district heating company in Sofia is actually arranging bills, and loads of other reasons which are systemic issues rather than personal circumstances. So what that has led to is a significant increase in the mass concentration of particle matters, particularly 2.5 particles. They have been up by 30% over the past 10 years, and there's been a 5-fold increase in the concentration of wood smoke traces. So the air quality in Bulgaria has been steadily decreasing, and quite regularly the places like Sofia record concentrations of particle matter 2.5 and 10, which are much higher than the limits set by the EU and the World Health Organization. And quite sadly, just like fuel poverty leads to premature deaths, I would say, unfortunately, air quality and decreasing air quality also leads to a lot of premature deaths in the country. So the connection actually, once you see it, is quite simple. Vulnerable households suffer from high fuel prices, poor infrastructure, poorly performing housing stock, heating systems, and the use of low quality fuel. So quite often that means wood, coal, briquettes. On several occasions of people I studied, I also encountered people who would burn things such as old clothes, plastics, and things that they generally find outside on the street. So people who are vulnerable households also have a tendency to have a limited information about options of how to heat themselves in a safe way, and they have limited information about the health impact of the heating options that unfortunately they're limited to. So an interesting thing about how energy is is provided and used in Bulgaria and in Sofia is that many households rely on multiple energy resources, and that could often include gas, electricity, district heating, and wood. Of going from, watching people in urban gardens do their gardening, then going into their homes and watching them prepare their Zimnina, and then visiting them again. And on a few occasions, I had to watch people basically eat their Zimnina, heat it up. I've seen that wood burning stoves coexist with electric radiators. There's central heating and air conditioning. Sometimes these multiple sources of heat are in the same room, and in some cases we see that each room in a house is kitted with an independent and different way of providing the necessary energy services. And the reasons for this are multifold. So the winter in Bulgaria, as I mentioned, could be quite harsh. Temperatures could drop to minus 15 degrees. Also, the way in which district heating and other forms of heat, such as electricity, are suffering from a series of systemic issues around billing and access to meters. In addition to that, Sofia also has quite poor building stock, which is in the process of being retrofitted. But a lot of people are stuck in properties that are not possible to be retrofitted for reasons which are not linked to whether they want to have them retrofitted or not. If you live in an apartment building, for example, there are certain things you can do to retrofit your own property. But if you want to have an external retrofitting, you would have to have the agreement of everyone in the whole apartment building. Quite often the funding which is available for retrofitting work also works in such a way that even if there is one household in the building not interested in carrying out the work, people cannot access the grants and financing available for it. At the same time, people have, through their experiences, through the multiple energy transitions that have taken place in Bulgaria for the past, let's say, from the early 80s onwards, people have doubts about how reliable different sources of energy are. And these reasons lead to this less than seamless kind of environment of energy provision and energy services within houses and apartments in Sofia. So as a result, Sofia experiences substantial emissions of short-lived climate pollutants. Black carbon, which is a particularly big contributor to global warming, is one of the most commonly encountered pollutants. And the reduction of particulate matter and nitric oxide pollution during the winter season is actually directly proportional to the reduction of solid fuels such as wood and coal for domestic heating. It's a quite straightforward link between fuel poverty and air pollution nexus. However, it's one which is very hard to impress on policymakers and urban planners. So the trade-offs that I talked about, which are inherent to understanding of how the urban nexus works and adopting an urban nexus thinking. So these trade-offs and choices faced by those in vulnerability to meet their heating needs are driven as much by the things that are traditionally associated with fuel poverty as they're driven by their coping practices. So this is where we start thinking about how do we bring these different elements of the urban nexus that I've been talking about. So means to practice urban gardening and making Zimnina is a way to manage access and affordability of heating in a way which allows vulnerable people to practice healthier energy use in the home. That could, in simple terms, mean they will have more resources to keep the district heating radiators on rather than adopt start thinking about how they are going to burn wood, briquettes, coal, or anything else in their apartments. So ability to synchronize the three practices of urban gardening, making Zimnina, and energy use and heating through the different parts of the year in order to manage the food, water, and energy resources really shapes the way environmental resources, such as clean air and gas emissions in the atmosphere, manage at an individual and household level. And I would say that Sofia, being a densely urbanized area, kind of provides additional restrictions on the ways in which urban gardening takes place, making Zimnina takes place. And also, I think it also ameliorates and amplifies the negative effects of using these less environmentally friendly means of heating themselves. So, apologies. As before, this is best put in the words of people I encountered during the study. One of them was Christo, who was 57. He was a taxi driver. And he explained that the way he manages this nexus on a personal and household level is through what he describes a complicated system that has taken him years to work out. And he was saying that just kind of changes to this system that could mean that he can no longer do it will be very hard to replace, and it's going to put him in a very precarious situation. So he's also preparing early. He starts collecting wood in May. In the year, he does a little bit here and there during the week. If he sees some pieces of wood, branches that cut off lying around, he takes it and puts it in the car, and he collects at least a bag of branches every weekend in one of the nearby parks. So he goes there for evening walks with his wife, and they pick up what they can see from the ground. It's the same with Zimnina, and the parallels here between the collection of wood and things to burn and the collection of food in order to prepare Zimnina are quite striking. So he also operates a jar here and there everyday policy. So he buys some of the stuff. He talked about specifically cheap plums that he found in the market. He talks about things that he sees in the market that are about to be thrown out because they're a bit perhaps hard to sell or slightly damaged. And he also grows some stuff such as green beans on his terrace, on windowsills, and just outside of his apartment building. So this is how, Christo was good at the art of bringing little things together and making something that lasts. So he describes it as just a few handfuls of stuff. That you add a clove of garlic, some herbs, and that is really helpful on days when they don't have a lot in the cupboards in the winter. They put a few potatoes on top of the wood burner to boil. It takes a bit longer to cook them this way, but then he's able to add the tomatoes and green beans that he has prepared to mix it all up, and throw other things such as pickled cabbage, another staple of Zimnina in Bulgaria. And that's him and his wife sorted for the day. He says it's really tasty and very easy to do. Christo lives in a very tall apartment building. His next door neighbor, however, is not able to get involved in making Zimnina in similar terms or to do urban gardening. And he is actually he has made a makeshift burner in his kitchen where he sleeps during the winter with his wife. They actually use this one room most of the time when they're at home. And Christo's neighbor actually often burns plastics or clothes and things that he finds outside. This is particularly difficult for Christo because Christo has an asthma, and whenever his neighbor burns plastics or clothes or anything else, there is there's smoke that comes out, and Christo's not able to open windows. But rather than being resentful, Christo explained to me that his neighbor is struggling more than he was, because they're not being able to plan ahead, and they're not have the same access to space in order to grow things. Particularly, he says that his neighbor's a hardworking couple, but the man has mobility problem, can't bend down and turn the soil, and his wife works all hours as a cleaner. So they are unable to make Zimnina from things that they grow. So they make Zimnina from things on the market, and that is expensive. So the way in which Christo's neighbor makes Zimnina and uses it, it's more of a not something that will help them survive on a day-to-day basis, but it's something as a treat, something which is considered to be much tastier and nicer than anything you can buy in the shop. So the reason why we talked about this extended urban nexus thinking is because it provides a great opportunity to reframe some of the ways in which national level policymakers, urban planners, and even researchers like ourselves who do research on transitions think about some of the problems that are being encountered by people. So interconnected practices of urban gardening and making Zimnina can help stop practices of reverting to more air polluting heat provision in Sofia, such as burning low-grade fuels, wood, plastics, or clothes, etc. I think this thinking about the whole urban nexus also presents vulnerable consumers and people in a very different light. I would say presents them as experts in resource distribution, rather than people who are struggling to manage the resources at their disposal. And I think that's a considerable change in the way policy and urban planning thinking can be put in place. And it's one that particularly policymakers and urban planners in Sofia really struggled with. So just to give one example, if we're thinking about a nexus intervention in Sofia to address issues around air pollution and fuel poverty, could involve providing support for urban gardening and making Zimnina. And that's very different from the way in which fuel poverty is supported right now. People who are considered to meet certain criteria for vulnerability are given lump sum of money to cover the cost of energy, which goes straight back to the energy company. Fuel poverty support this way, if we are thinking about a nexus intervention that supports urban gardening and making Zimnina, that would mean that the support itself would not be limited to the winter months, but it will be something that could happen for most of the year. As I've discussed, urban gardening can take place from March until November, and gardens in Sofia can produce vegetables such as broccoli and spinach even during the winter months. So that means that in order for this kind of urban nexus thinking interventions to be introduced, there has to be a acceptance, political acceptance and understanding of how these issues are interconnected. However, the connections across the food, water, energy, and the environment, or the urban nexus in Sofia, are poorly understood and politically neglected. And the reasons for that is a sum of the kind of misfortunate framings that I encountered when talking to policymakers and urban planners. So, for example, I was told that these are not really urban practices. The making Zimnina is something that happens in villages because it's something that requires open fires and the idea of policymakers was that people would actually go to ancestral homes in villages outside of the capital, and this is where they would make Zimnina. But what we found is that Zimnina and the multiple transformations, which are involved, the blending, the freezing, the boiling, the grilling, they're spread over time and multiple sites of transformations. And some of them might be hundreds of kilometers away from Sofia. And this particular travel of going backward and forward could be the cause of a lot of associated emissions, but it doesn't make them any less part of these urban practices. We were also told that Zimnina making doesn't really matter because it's not widespread and it was used for self-consumption only. And this was seen as a reason why the government or policymakers shouldn't actually get involved. I was told that if Zimnina was being sold, that would be a different story. But in fact, what I found out is that Zimnina, and particularly jars of Zimnina, like this one, travel quite far and are regularly passed on and exchanged with family, friends, and neighbors and people that are considered to be in need. I encountered a lot of arrangements where different households would come together. Some would buy some of the stuff for making Zimnina, others will provide produce, some will provide the space, and they will come together. And a lot of cases, people also paid other people in order to prepare Zimnina and to bring it to their home. One of the most powerful narratives that led to this blindness of policy to the urban nexus and its implications had to do with the fact that a lot of kind of policy people believe that urban gardening and Zimnina are just hobbies. And this is a powerful quote from someone I interviewed that thought that urban gardening is practiced by a handful of people who have lived outside of the country and after their return to Bulgaria, seeking to replicate a Western way of living. The interesting thing about this quote is while we're having this discussion, I look down and this person I was interviewing, I looked down at their hands, and their hands were basically had multiple little cuts, and they were colored like the hands of someone who would peel several kilograms of peppers and tomatoes in order to prepare something like Ralitsa. So although they were clearly engaged in this practice themselves, they didn't seem for it to be essential or something which was widely spread. Because this belief that these were non-essential practices, they were optional, they were not primary candidates for public resources, and particularly there were a lot of people who were trying to start up urban gardens in Sofia, and they were trying to get access to suitable green land, and also in some cases to ways in which they can use water resources on these green properties. And it was particularly hard for them at this point, because not only because urban gardening didn't have an official definition, but because it wasn't seen as something that could actually help people who are vulnerable. It was seen as something which is optional. And I'm hoping that if I manage to convey anything today, is that for people like Christo, Maria, and Anna, it's far from optional. It's a way of living. Another narrative which was very helpful was that urban gardening and making Zimnina small scale, they're informal practices and they're things from the past. So there was the narrative that Zimnina does not happen in cities anymore, and it was just happening in some villages and peri-urban areas. And therefore it was an issue that should be addressed there rather than in cities like Sofia. So there were no institutional understanding of interdependencies. There were no policy or action which aimed to address the nexus challenges. And when policymakers talked about nexus challenges, They were limited to categories such as waste to energy or water as food type of practices. So in the final minutes of this presentation, I wanted to talk about how this particular experience changed how I did research and changed the way in which I sought to create impact with talked about just now. It was really level that there was a lot of merit in adopting a nexus thinking in order to understand how these different systems of provisions and practices are related and how they can support each other and provide alternative ways of addressing issues such as fuel poverty and air pollution. Instead, the policymakers I spoke to would talk about things such as these particular graphs that you can see here. They can show household average spend. This is the top one, and the bottom one is about levels of vulnerability in Bulgaria. So they would talk about figures, and they would talk to me about evidence. And the evidence that they wanted was primarily linked to quantitative data. They asked me why was I not doing surveys to show them the numbers of people that were actually engaging in these practices, and they were sure that I've been spoken to a few rare examples of urban gardeners and other type of Zimnina makers and users. However, this is at the point at which I decided that there was a merit in me completely changing the way I looked at evidence. At the end of my fieldwork in Bulgaria, I was given as a present from many of the participants with whom I peeled tomatoes and peppers, 16 jars of Zimnina. And I used 9 of them to take them to 9 different meetings with policymakers where we talked about fuel poverty, energy transition, and evidence for solid policy making in urban gardening. And whenever I came to the wall, it was like a wall of policymakers thinking that this was not sufficient evidence. I will roll out my jar, this one here, and I'll talk to them about how this jar contained the urban nexus and how they spoke about the different practices around fuel poverty, the way in which food, water, energy are linked, and the way in which air pollution is inherently linked to these practices, and the ways in which they are related. And I found that that appealed on a very different level. We're not talking about the rational kind of clarity that comes with facts and figures. So we're talking about a different types of emotional connection that people, particularly in Bulgaria, had with these jars of Zimnina. I think a lot of the people I spoke to have had Zimnina, and they understood what was involved in it. They could clearly see it. I don't think it led to any changes in specific policies yet, but I think of all 9 people I brought jars to, I think they all agreed that this was one of the most compelling evidence which was ever introduced. So by doing that, I started a whole new line of research, for which I have carried out 2 independent projects where I looked at how we can create complementary ways of providing evidence for policymakers, where we not only use statistical information and modeling, which is quite abstract, but we use objects of the transition that helps us understand some of the hidden relationships between heterogeneous systems and elements in a way which is emotional and appeals to us as human beings. I think I've advanced quite a bit with time, so I'm gonna leave it here and switch off my PowerPoint slides. And I look forward to a discussion on the linkages that exist with transitions thinking and the cohort of new researchers that you represent. Thank you very much for listening at this point.
Thank you very much, Ralitsa. First, for this illustrative way to point out all the elements of a system. We are speaking about system, talking about system, thinking in system. And we are all actually part of a system. I think it's extremely important for all of us before starting thinking of solutions to be able to define the problems correctly, which is actually the case with the energy poverty in Bulgaria. And you show us with your presentation, energy poverty in Bulgaria is firstly, before everything else, a poverty, so lack of all kinds of resources. And the jars that you show us, they are artifacts, materialization of this cultural heritage. Zimnina is not only a way of saving energy, but it's also a healthy way of nutrition. It brings a lot of knowledge from our grandparents and previous generation. We got a bunch of questions for you. So I will start with some of them with the first one. Jan Starke is asking, Ralitsa, observing such interconnected nexus, what are the implications for transitions researcher? To what extent it's even helpful or feasible to demarcate singular transitions like the clean energy transition, or would this pull change processes out of the nexus context?
Yeah, thank you for this question. Actually, a few minutes before the keynote started, I was part of the Energizer, and one of the questions was during the Energizer session was like, which do you think is the most important transition? Is it the energy transition or other types of transitions? And although I am essentially a energy transition by heritage, and this is what I was trained in, I have to say that the compellingness of the Urban Nexus research is show how you cannot change one system without leading to changes to other systems. And for me, it will be counterproductive to focus on improving one specific system, such as the energy system, in order to address issues like fuel poverty or climate change, air pollution. I think a useful way to move in a more just and inclusive way will be to consider not only what kind of policies can be put in place from the bottom to seek to lead to more efficiency at a system level, but to consider actually the ways in which the lived experiences of people who are disadvantaged by current systems, how they can be used to introduce more resilience and alternative approaches to addressing these. So in SPRU, where I'm based, we have a lot of energy transition scholars. And some of my colleagues, such as Jochen Scott and Ed Steinmüller, talk about deep transitions. So these are deep underlying transitions, which are made up of a series of smaller transitions. And quite often I think about that nexus thinking, and particularly focusing on the ways in which different types of transitions are interlinked in a way that leads to emergent properties that could sometimes become hidden in dominant ways of thinking about transition, such as the MLP, such as this. I think this kind of thinking could be quite useful, and I think it's up to you to figure out ways in which you can introduce it to existing dominant literature. I see clear benefits from doing it. So I will watch this space and hope some of you pick up this work.
Sorry, I have to unmute myself. Matteo is asking whether you perceive this type of urban gardening and cooking as sustainable practice. What is your opinion on this?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. As a matter of fact, I have to say that the elements of the project that are presented here was just one part of it, and a lot of the urban gardeners and Zimnina makers that I studied were actually attracted into were doing it because of the health benefits, because of being, because of other systemic issues around food safety and public health. And then being able to control what goes into their food and wanting to kind of consume certain quality of food. So we actually looked at the ways in which those kind of sustainable ways of thinking about the urban nexus, how they sat against those vulnerability understanding of the urban nexus. And I had to say that that was extremely difficult to do. What I find quite difficult when we talk about sustainability is the extent to which what we define as sustainable, what our understanding of sustainability is, and what sustainable practices are, and how badly they fit within the realities of some of the people I spoke about. I think it's all relative. I would say that the practices, for example, that Christo talks about in comparison with his neighbors, I would not have described them as sustainable, but relative to his neighbor, I would say it's more sustainable because it leads to a lot less air pollution. And in terms of, I would like to think of them as kind of telling us important aspects of resilience. I think this is the one bit that I'm quite interested in as a result of this finding, and that is how you can achieve a certain level of individual and household-based resilience in a system and a society which is constantly changing.
So can we actually conclude that sustainability could be defined in a different way for vulnerable people?
I think we need to have a broad understanding of what sustainability is, and one of the key issues with sustainability literature is that for a long period of time, it tends to be focused on specific type of systems, such as energy systems, transport systems, and specific contexts, which were quite Eurocentric. And it's in the recent years that we have seen a real expansion on different contexts and how what is being studied in these contexts, such as China, for example, the developing world, that it's really challenging some of the assumptions of how different types of transitions are taking place and what are the implications of these transitions for these specific contexts. So I think it's quite important to continue to expand and to consider how what we learn about these different contexts changes our conceptualization of what is sustainable transitions. On a personal level, I believe that the more we think about and do things about sustainability, the more kind of moral commitment we have to sustainability. And it's quite likely that if we engage in this kind of sustainable thinking for long periods of time, the kind of the end goal, the post will move quite a bit with our understanding. And I sincerely hope that this is what we're going to see. On a personal level, I hope one thing became clear, that I was quite emotionally engaged and committed to this project, not only because it was one of the first cases where I actually directly worked with vulnerable people, and not only because it was at home, but mostly because I think passion and emotions are quite important in doing research, particularly on transitions, because it pushes you to do things and see things differently. And that's something that I would strongly encourage everyone to retain. The more passionate you're about something, the more likely you are that you're going to uncover different elements of it. So I would say for myself and a lot of other transition scholars, this is not just a research area. It's something that we're deeply committed to on a personal level.
There's a question from Marie. She's asking if you experience the development of networks to collaboratively do urban gardening and make Zimnina and Sofia, for example, for sharing space and tools. And I would like to add another question to this one about the connection between these practices and the young people. This was a question from Martel. How important is that the knowledge on these practices is transferred to the newer generation?
That's a good question. Thank you very much. I would say that I don't want you to be left with the impression that there is only a negative story to tell here. As a matter of fact, something that I didn't focus on is that watching how this one of the urban gardens that I studied, and I mentioned Druzhba, how it actually developed over time, and the relationships between old people and younger people in it were some of the most rewarding aspects of fieldwork that I've ever experienced. I would say that since I concluded the research early in 2018, a lot has changed in Sofia. And the urban gardening movement has emerged as a very strong movement, which is quite inclusive. So the urban garden in Druzhba that I was fortunate enough to observe for a long period of time had quite a lot of pensioners that were able to kind of not teach, but they share their knowledge about what's the easiest way to do things in the garden, because it's quite labor intensive, and there was a lot of cooperation, sharing of tools. It was truly a communal garden. And one of the best things that I've seen also emerge from this garden is a collaboration with a solidarity kitchen, Food Not Bombs, in Sofia. They do wonderful work, and they started doing urban gardening with volunteers so that they're able to provide food they take care of something up to, I think, 100 vulnerable people in Sofia by providing them vegan, vegetarian meals a few times a week, sometimes every day. And I have to say that ability to grow their own food and to preserve this food for the winter has been a game changer and has provided a more stable source of food and resources for a lot of vulnerable people. So I would say that rather than seeing this being most of my examples were pensioners, but that doesn't represent the type of people who are involved. There's a lot of young people involved in the growth of urban gardens.
There's a set of questions related to policy. So David asked, but this was at the beginning of your presentation, in the first part, if the local or regional government is carrying out any strategy to promote an urban transition in Sofia. Maybe you could also elaborate more on this. And then we have also a question from Leo. Leo Frank, he is asking, does it still make sense to think about experimentation when potential failures, which are a necessary part of experiments, have potentially dramatic effects on vulnerable people related to policy experimentation in transition studies?
I will start with Leo's question first, and that is the fuel poverty in Bulgaria is quite normalized, and this is the really scary thought, that it's not considered to be something quite shocking, or it's not considered to be a crisis, at least at a national level, and something that has to be addressed in a more systemic way. And I think things like the Solidarity Garden, the Solidarity Kitchen, they are experiments. They're bottom-up, grassroots level, innovative experiments, which have, and this is in relation to the first question, have successfully found avenues of linking up to more progressive urban planners in Sofia. They haven't gone as far as national level policy, but they have managed to at least argue quite successfully for providing a definition of urban gardening for planning in Sofia. And this is a game changer, because if there is a definition, then you can start building policies around it. I would say that the one misfortunate element of decision makers at national and urban policy level is not only the failure to recognize the multiple ways in which these different elements of the urban nexus are linked to each other and how they manifest, but it would also kind of challenges the assumption that you cannot work with informal groups such as Solidarity Kitchen or a kind of an urban garden, which is an assemblage of different people, can change between seasons. You cannot, as a policy and decision maker, there is an understanding that you can work with these people in order to create new experiments and new pilots. And the kind of experiments that I would suggest that will be quite useful to be carried out are not to do with kind of removing one form of support, for example, the winter fuel payments, but it will be about trying to provide different type of support to people who are experiencing fuel poverty. And that will be specific. For example, it could be free travel, in recognition that urban gardening and making Zimnina are practices in Sofia which take place in multiple spaces. Free travel is going to be a game changer for a lot of people. There was one person I was observing in the urban garden in Druzhba. I mentioned him. He used to travel for more than an hour and a half in each direction from one part of Sofia in order to get to the garden. And there were, in the summer, he had to do this almost on a daily basis. There are also opportunities to give people access to free gardening tools, and perhaps to give people access to free water so they can do more urban gardening. So there is, I think, a plethora of different ways in which experimentation can take place to find out what will be the best way in which to support people in a way that allows them to continue to practice something that's tried and tested and really works for them.
Sam Gürsan, I hope I have pronounced the name correctly. Would like to know whether you have considered using models as white boxes instead of abstract black boxing models that show only numbers and graphs. Building models together with policymakers can be one way of showing the different interdependencies in the food, water, and energy nexus.
I mean, there are many multiple ways in which you can attempt to co-create understanding and solutions with policymakers. I don't have sufficient knowledge by white boxes modeling. unfortunately, in my life, I have mainly worked with different types of models, but I would say that anything that kind of gives you an opportunity to engage with policymakers and decision makers, not only on a professional but personal level, would be quite useful in this sense. And particularly in the context of Sofia, there was a lot of denial around urban gardening, making Zimnina, and I encountered a lot of denial about fuel poverty. I mean, at one point, people I was talking to in the urban gardens were denying that they were in fuel poverty on a personal level. And then I would go into their homes and I would look at the ways in which they arrange their lives and think that I would definitely define this as fuel poor, because it fits most of the definitions that we're used to. But they wouldn't assess themselves or define themselves in those terms. And that was not just linked to pride, it was linked to the fact that they have found a way in which they manage and consider themselves to be quite lucky in the way in which they're able to manage this. So I believe that any process that can bring those people together with decision makers and policymakers and help co-create solutions and help foster understanding would work really well. And I admit that rolling up to a lot of national level policymakers with jars of Ralitsa and talking to them about fuel poverty and air pollution has not been a very pleasant experience, at least in at the start of the conversations. And it's a pretty brave move, maybe slightly silly and stupid as well. So you just have to see it to the end, because otherwise you just become this person that turned up to this meeting with jars of Ralitsa and wanted to talk about, systemic change and doing, policy differently. So I'm sure you find multiple ways in which this could work.
We are at the end of the session. That's why I'm asking the last question from Ines, and would like to ask you for a short answer. What do you think would be the implication of your study, or how do you think would you apply the findings outside of the Sofia context in other places, other urban smaller cities or villages outside Sofia?
I think because of the nature of the practices of urban gardening and Zimnina making, first of all, Bulgaria is by far not the only country in Europe that, for which these practices are deeply embedded. We have seen similar things in Greece, in Poland, in a lot of in Serbia and Croatia, and in a lot of countries, the Balkans and Central and Eastern European countries. And I would say that the findings that we have in Sofia could be quite easily replicated in any of these contexts, because there is a lot of similarities around the systemic issues that have, in a way, produced these kind of coping strategies. Also, I'll have to say that although Sofia and the densely populated area presented specific challenges, we have already seen similar initiatives starting in other places in the country, such as Varna and Plovdiv. They notably now have networks that organize around urban gardening and solidarity movements. So this is already an indication that the urban nexus and these coping practices exist beyond the Sofia case, both in a subnational context and outside of Bulgaria.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting, for me also emotional. as I said, we are at the end of the session, and I would like to ask you to check on the program which rooms you have to enter after the break. And another comment, it's about the organization of next year's conference. Yesterday we had a small get-together, but I'm sure that not everyone could participate there. So I will put in the chat a form which you could fill in if you're interested in another session, another conversation, another online meeting where we can discuss the options for organizing next year conference. Ralitsa, thank you very much for being with us today and to present us this detailed insight. We hope that you will be around for further questions. If not, I guess our participants could connect with you and discuss it further.
That would be great. Thank you very much for the invitation. And for those of you who are not able to make it to Sofia in person, I strongly encourage you to do so once it's safe, and to find someone that can share with you some Lutenita.
I also promised Ralitsa to send her Lutenita to UK, but probably I would be able to do it. Okay, thank you everyone, and see you around.